Bael was alone in the deep observation chamber when the instruments first noticed something wrong. That was how she would always remember it afterward, not as a discovery, not as a revelation, but as an instrument noticing something wrong. The array of crystalline receivers that ring the chamber's upper dome had been calibrated to listen for quantum coherence fluctuations at the boundary layer of observable space. A project Bael had been running for 11 years with almost no institutional support and considerable private ridicule. The project was called, in the formal language of the Orvithai Academy's grant registry, Longitudinal Survey of Peripheral Metric Distortion in Transboundary Vacuum States, which was a name she had chosen deliberately because it was boring enough to avoid attracting critics while still being accurate enough to satisfy the ethics committee. In informal language that Bael used inside her own three brains, she called it listening at the wall. She had been working at her primary calculation desk. Her lower four sensory appendages curled beneath her body in the resting configuration, while her upper two appendages moved through the holographic notation field, tracing the symbols of her current theoretical project, a refinement of her ideas about metric topology and closed-boundary cosmological systems, ideas that had occupied her for most of her adult life and that, she was increasingly convinced, were more than merely theoretical. The chamber was dark except for glow of the notation field and the faint blue luminescence of the receiver array above her. It was the middle of the deep night cycle. No one else was in the building. The alert was not loud. It was, in fact, almost apologetically quiet, a soft harmonic pulse from the monitoring system, the kind of alert that indicated an anomalous reading rather than a critical instrument failure. Bael's second brain, which handled background environmental monitoring even when her first brain was deep in calculation and her third brain was in its partial rest cycle, registered the alert and determined it was worth interrupting the other two. She looked up. The display above the receiver array was showing a pattern she did not immediately recognize, which was unusual. Bael had an extraordinarily comprehensive memory across all three of her brains, and she had spent 11 years staring at the outputs of this particular array. She knew its noise profiles the way she knew her own cognitive rhythms. She knew the characteristic signatures of cosmic background interference, of instrument drift, of the occasional gravitational lensing event that could fool the array into thinking it had caught something at the boundary. She knew all of these things, and she did not recognize what she was seeing. She moved to the main display and stood before it for a long time. The pattern in the data was not random. That was the first thing she established, running a standard randomness analysis through her first brain while her second brain began pulling up comparative data sets, and her third brain woke fully from its rest cycle and trained its attention on the display with a particular focus intensity it reserved for problems it had decided were serious. The pattern was not random. It had structure. It had, she realized after approximately 40 seconds of analysis, recursive structure that repeated at different scales, like a mathematical object that looked the same whether you examined its broad outlines or its finest details. Her third brain, which was the one most responsible for what the Orvithai called a sudden knowing, the moment of intuitive recognition that preceded formal proof, said something to her other two brains that none of them had language for yet. It was a feeling rather than a thought. It was a feeling of standing at the edge of something very large and looking down. She began to work. The signal, because she was already calling it a signal in the privacy of her own cognition, though she was not yet ready to use that word aloud, was embedded in the quantum coherence fluctuation data from the boundary receivers, the instruments positioned to detect distortions at the very edge of observable space where the metric of the universe began its terminal attenuation. The signal was extraordinarily faint. Her instruments had been accumulating data for 11 years, and the pattern she was now seeing was only visible because she had 11 years of data to work with. If she had begun listening at the wall 1 year later, or if her grant had been cut after the first round of reviews, as several senior theorists had recommended, she would not have had enough accumulated sensitivity to see it at all. This thought would return to her many times in the years ahead, always accompanied by a quality of vertigo that she found difficult to describe. She worked through the deep night cycle and into the early morning, and she did not stop when the building began to fill with the sounds of other researchers arriving, and she did not stop when her research assistant Veth knocked on the chamber door to ask if she had eaten, and she did not stop when the midday alert pulsed through the building's environmental system. She stopped only when she had completed the first stage of analysis, which told her the following things. The signal had not originated from within the observable universe. The direction analysis was unambiguous on this point. The coherence fluctuations were not propagating from any point in three-dimensional space. They were arriving, insofar as the mathematics had a way to describe it, from beyond the metric boundary, from the region that Bael's own theoretical work described as a transboundary vacuum state, the space that her unpopular and largely unread papers had argued must exist on the other side of what most cosmologists treated as a simple termination of space itself. Most cosmologists thought there was nothing beyond the observable boundary. They thought that asking what existed beyond it was like asking what existed north of the northernmost point, a question that sounded meaningful but dissolved upon examination into a category error. Bael had spent 17 years arguing that they were wrong, that the boundary was a boundary and not an ending, that something was on the other side of it. The signal had been traveling for approximately 14 billion years. This figure was not perfectly precise. The error bars were significant, but the order of magnitude was robust. 14 billion years. The universe itself was not much older than 14 billion years. Whatever had sent this signal had sent it at very nearly the beginning of all things, and it was only arriving now. The signal contained mathematics. This was the point at which Bael sat down on the floor of the observation chamber and remained there for some time without moving. She had not sat on the floor since she was a child. The floor was cold and slightly dusty. One of her upper appendages found a small piece of crystalline debris from some old instrument installation and turned it over and over without her conscious direction. Her three brains were doing different things simultaneously. Her first brain was running verification analysis compulsively, checking and rechecking the mathematics of the directionality findings. Her second brain was constructing a timeline of what she would need to do next, in what order and with what resources. And her third brain was sitting very quietly in a state she had never experienced before, a state that was not quite thought, and not quite emotion, but was something that seemed to be the response a mind generates when it encounters something that exceeds the categories it was built to handle. The mathematics in the signal was not arbitrary. It was not simply a prime number sequence or a geometric progression of the kind that early Zen communication theorists had imagined would constitute the simplest possible universal language. It was far more complex than that. It was structured like a proof. Specifically, it was structured like a proof of the kind found in advanced topological cosmology, the subfield of physics that Bael had spent her career developing. The subfield that almost no other physicist had found worth pursuing, the subfield whose notation system she had invented herself, because the existing mathematical languages were inadequate to describe the object she needed to describe. The notation in the signal was her notation, not approximately her notation, not a convergent independent invention of similar symbolic tools. Her notation, the specific symbols, the particular way of indicating relational direction across a boundary metric, the idiosyncratic method she used to denote recursive self-similarity in topological space. All of it was hers. She had published this notation system in a paper 17 years ago, a paper that had received a polite acknowledgement from the committee that reviewed her grant application and had subsequently been cited by 4 other researchers, 3 of whom were her own former students, and one of whom had cited it only to note that he found her notation unnecessarily complicated. Something that existed outside the boundary of the universe had read that paper. Something that existed outside the boundary of the universe had been waiting for approximately 14 billion years for someone inside the universe to develop the mathematical tools necessary to receive a message, and that someone had turned out to be her, and the message had been waiting in the signal all along. Encoded in mathematics, it had known she would eventually invent. She got up off the floor. She thought about what to do next for a long time. Long enough that the deep night cycle came again, and she was once more alone in the building. She thought about going immediately to the chancellor of the Orvithai Academy, who was a reasonable being named Soreth, who had always treated Bael's unconventional research with a respectful skepticism that she found more tolerable than most people's responses. She thought about calling her 3 closest colleagues, all of them theorists she trusted. She thought about doing nothing, simply continuing to analyze the signal herself, alone, for as long as she needed to understand it before she said anything to anyone. She decided on a middle path. She would spend 14 more days in intensive analysis before she told anyone anything. 14 days was arbitrary. She chose it because it felt like long enough to be certain she was not making a catastrophic error, and short enough that she would not be deceiving her institution. During those 14 days, she would do nothing else. She would eat at her desk. She would sleep in the small rest chamber attached to the observation room. She would not respond to non-essential communications. Veth would handle her administrative correspondence, as he always did when she was deep in a project. She began. The 14 days were the most extraordinary intellectual experience of Bael's life, and her life had contained many extraordinary intellectual experiences. She was, as the Academy's public communications frequently and somewhat embarrassingly noted, the greatest theoretical physicist alive, a description she found reductive in the way that all such descriptions are reductive, since it implied that physics was a competition, and that she had won it. She did not experience physics as a competition. She experienced it the way she imagined musicians experience music, as a vast and intricate structure that existed independently of any individual mind, that was being explored rather than constructed, that rewarded patience and precision and a willingness to follow its internal logic wherever it led, even when it led somewhere uncomfortable. The mathematics in the signal rewarded all of those qualities. It was, she understood within the first 3 days, a proof of a theorem she had published 17 years ago. The theorem concerned the topological properties of boundary metrics in closed cosmological systems. Specifically, it argued that a universe of the type this one appeared to be, bounded and self-consistent, was necessarily embedded in a larger space with specific mathematical properties, and that the boundary was permeable in principle to certain kinds of information, even if not to matter or energy. The proof she had published was, she had always privately known, incomplete, she had proven that if such permeability existed, it would have specific mathematical characteristics. She had not proven that the permeability actually existed. The signal contained the missing half of the proof. By day 7, she was certain of this. The mathematics coming through the signal, fragmentary, partial, sometimes so attenuated by the 14 billion year journey that she had to reconstruct passages from surrounding context, was completing her theorem. It was filling in exactly the steps she had been unable to fill in herself. The steps she had told herself for 17 years simply awaited more sophisticated mathematical tools. The entity outside the boundary had those tools. It was sharing them. The proof it was sending was internally consistent, was formally rigorous in a way she could verify even through the noise and fragmentation, and led to a conclusion she had not anticipated when she began the theorem herself. The conclusion was that the permeability was not passive. It was not simply a mathematical property that existed in principle. It was a channel. It was, in the precise technical vocabulary of transboundary metric topology, an initiated channel, meaning it had been opened deliberately from one side by something that understood the mathematics well enough to do so. By day 12, she had reconstructed approximately 60% of what the signal contained. The remaining 40% was deeply fragmented. The noise-to-signal ratio increased as she tried to extract finer-grained detail, which she interpreted as meaning that the most complex portions of the message had suffered the most degradation over 14 billion years of transit. She could see the shapes of the missing pieces. She could see where the mathematics was going, but she could not see all of it yet, and she was not willing to speculate about the whole from the part. Not yet. On day 14, she called the Chancellor. Sorth arrived at the deep observation chamber, within an hour of receiving Bael's communication. The Chancellor was older than Bael by several decades, a biologist by training who had moved into administrative leadership late in her career, and she was one of the beings in the galaxy whom Bael genuinely respected without reservation. Sorth had a quality of stillness that Bael had always admired, the ability to receive astonishing information without the receiver's agitation distorting the shape of what was being received. Sorth sat very still for a long time after Bael finished presenting her findings. "You're certain?" Sorth said. This was not a question exactly. It was something between a question and an invitation. "I am as certain as I could be given 14 days of analysis," Bael said. "Which means I am more certain than I have been of almost anything in my career, and also less certain than I would like to be before saying what I am about to say to you." "Say it." "Something outside the universe sent me a mathematical proof using my own notation. It sent it 14 billion years ago. I think it sent it 14 billion years ago because it could see forward in time, or because the nature of transboundary existence means that temporal sequence, as we experience, it does not apply to whatever's out there, and it knew that this was when the signal would arrive and be understood. I think the signal contains more than the proof. I think the proof is preliminary. I think whatever is outside the universe wanted to establish its credentials, to prove that it knew my mathematics well enough to be taken seriously, before delivering the actual message, which is in the latter portions of the signal that I have not yet been able to fully decode. Soreth was quiet for a moment. What do you need? This was, Bael thought, precisely the right question, asked at precisely the right moment, and it was one of the reasons she respected Soreth so deeply. Another chancellor might have asked about verification protocols, or institutional risk assessment, or communication strategy. Soreth asked what Bael needed. More computing power, Bael said, and the signal recovery specialist from the Peripheral Detection Laboratory, and theorists when and theorists Calabash, if they're willing to sign a confidentiality agreement, and possibly 6 months. You'll have all of it within a week, Sora said. The confidentiality agreement. How long? Until I have decoded enough of the message to be confident about what it says. Then we go to the full Academy Council. Agreed. Sora stood and then paused. Bael, are you all right? Bael considered the question seriously, which she always did when Soreth asked it. I don't know, she said honestly. I think I will be. I think this is what the work was always for. I don't know how to feel about that yet. Soreth left. Bael turned back to the data. The next 6 months were the most productive and the most exhausting period of Bael's life. The signal recovery specialist from the Peripheral Detection Laboratory, a team of 4 beings led by a brilliantly precise technician named Orith, who communicated almost exclusively in numerical notation, worked with Bael's receiver array to extract every additional fragment they could find in the noise. Theorist went and theorist Calabash, her 2 oldest colleagues, and the only other working physicists she knew who were fluent in her notation system, worked beside her every day to verify her interpretations. The computing resources Soreth had promised materialized. An entire wing of the Academy's Analysis Center was quietly redirected to processing the signal data. By the end of the first month, they had recovered 73% of the message. By the end of the third month, 89%. By the end of the 5th month, 94%. The remaining 6% was, they determined, permanently unrecoverable. The signal had been too degraded in transit. Those fragments were gone. But 94%, it turned out, was enough to understand what was being said. It was enough to understand what existed outside the universe. It was enough to understand what it wanted. Bael called the full Academy Council meeting on the first day of the 6th month. The Academy Council occupied the great chamber at the heart of the original building, the oldest structure on Orbithi Prime, a room whose walls were lined with the preserved theoretical frameworks of every major advance in physical science since the Orbithi had developed a capacity for systematic inquiry. Bael had given presentations in this room many times in her career, though never for anything that felt like this. The room held approximately 200 beings, council members, senior theorists, department heads, and the several external advisors whom Soreth had invited with carefully managed confidentiality protocols. They were all looking at Bael. She began with the signal. She presented the detection, the directionality analysis, the age estimate. She watched the room absorb the news that the signal had originated outside the universe with a remarkable variety of expressions. Several of her colleagues showed the frozen stillness of minds encountering something that had shattered a foundational assumption. Several others showed immediate skepticism, which she had expected and prepared for. Several showed the bright, frightened excitement of beings who had just understood that the world was vastly larger than they had believed. She presented the mathematics. She spent considerable time on this section because she needed them to understand not just that the signal contained mathematical content, but that the mathematical content was impossible to account for by any alternative explanation. Some of them were not fluent in her notation, and she had prepared simplified translations. She walked them through the completion of her theorem step by step. She showed them the proof in full. She showed them where her published version ended and where the incoming version began. She showed them that the incoming mathematics was formally rigorous, independently verifiable, and used her notation with precision that exceeded even her own published examples in certain respects. When she finished that section, she paused and looked at the room. "I want to address the obvious alternative explanations," she said, "because you will all have thought of them, and we have spent considerable time evaluating them." She went through the list. Instrument error, ruled out by the 11-year accumulation pattern, and the cross-verification with entirely independent detection systems they had quietly recruited. An unknown natural process, evaluated extensively against every known physical mechanism and against many theoretical ones, none of which were consistent with the signal's characteristics, particularly its use of her specific notation. A fabrication of some kind. She discussed this with the bluntness it deserved. The signal had been propagating through the receiver array for 11 years, accumulating in tiny increments, before the pattern became visible. It was not fabricated. It was not possible to fabricate something like this. And if it were, whoever had fabricated it would have needed access to an unpublished notation system that had existed in her private working notes for years before its formal publication. She saw the skeptics in the room shift, not to belief, not yet, but to a different quality of attention. Then she presented the content of the decoded message itself. The room became very quiet. What the message contained, in the portion that it decoded most clearly, was the following: a description of the nature of the entity that had sent it, not a self-description in the narrative sense, not identity, not history in the way she would have written her own history, rather a mathematical self-description, a topology. The entity outside the universe was describing itself in the only language it had apparently determined would survive the transit: mathematics. The description it gave was of something that had no equivalent in any cosmological framework the Orvithai Academy had ever seriously considered. It was not a being in the sense of having a body, a location, a discrete boundary that separated it from its environment. It was, as best Bael and her colleagues have been able to interpret the mathematics, something that existed in the structural relationships between things rather than in anything itself. It was in the formal vocabulary she had been developing to describe it: a pattern entity, a self-sustaining configuration of information and physical law that persisted not by occupying space, but by being encoded in the properties of space. It lived, if that word was applicable, in the mathematics of the boundary metric. It was the boundary metric, in some sense, that her theoretical framework was only beginning to have the tools to describe. And it was old, older than the universe, older than this universe, at any rate. The mathematics suggested that this entity had existed through previous iterations of something like what they occupied, previous cosmological cycles, or perhaps something better described as sibling universes, or perhaps something for which she did not yet have an adequate concept. It had watched many universes begin and end. It had tried to communicate with the inhabitants of other universes before this one. This was the point at which the great chamber, which had been very quiet, became quieter still. Bael let the silence persist for a moment before she continued. "The message contains records," she said, "or mathematical structures that I believe represent records, summaries of previous communication attempts. In all previous cases, the entity reports, in the notation, as best we can interpret it, that the inhabitants of those universes either never developed the mathematics necessary to receive the message or developed something close to it, but died out before the signal arrived. This is the first time, as far as the entity's records indicate, that the signal has been received." Theorist Wen, who was sitting to her left, added quietly, "We believe the 14 billion year travel time was not an accident of physics, but a deliberate calibration. The entity sent the signal time to arrive when it estimated, from outside the universe, from whatever vantage point permits this kind of calculation, that the mathematics necessary to decode it would exist. It sent the signal at the beginning of time because it could see, in some sense we do not yet understand, that this moment would come." The questions that followed lasted for many hours. Bael answered them carefully and honestly, which meant she spent a great deal of time saying she did not know and explaining precisely what she did know and why she was confident in it. The skeptics asked hard questions that she had already asked herself, and she walked through her answers methodically. The enthusiasts asked questions that ranged from profound to naive, and she treated each with equal seriousness. At the end of the session, Soreth called a brief recess, and then, when the room had reassembled, said to the council in a level voice that this information would need to be shared with the broader scientific community. Not immediately, not without a verification protocol, but soon and widely. The Orvithai Academy had a responsibility that it could not fulfill by keeping this contained. No one in the room argued. This, too, Bael found remarkable. The decision to share the signal data and the initial decoded findings with the other major scientific institutions of the galaxy was made over the following 3 weeks, in consultation with the Orvithai Academy's Interstellar Relations Office, and with 3 external advisors who had been living under confidentiality agreements since the beginning. The communication was carefully structured, first to the other 5 major scientific academies, with full data packages and an invitation to independent verification, then, contingent on those institutions' responses, to the broader network of research institutions, then, only after some degree of scientific consensus had formed, to the governments and public of the various species. The reaction of the other scientific institutions varied enormously according to the nature of those institutions, and those variations would themselves become, in subsequent years, the subject of significant anthropological and sociological study. The Veshan Institute of Physical Inquiry, whose membership were a long-lived species of beings that communicated through a combination of color modulation and subsonic vibration, responded within 2 weeks with a message that was, by any reasonable interpretation, excited. The Veshan were a species known for what other civilizations typically experienced as extreme emotional restraint. They had a culture built around the ideal of what they called the clear mind, a state of absolute intellectual composure that their most accomplished members cultivated over decades of practice. The message from the Veshan Institute was, by their own standards, temperate and measured. Bael, who had spent enough time corresponding with Veshan scientists to have developed some sensitivity to their emotional register, read it as something close to jubilant. The Morith Collective Mind Scientific Subdirectory, representing a hive species whose individual components averaged about 4 centimeters in length and whose collective intelligence was considerable, took longer, nearly a month, to respond, and when it did, the response was extremely long. The Morith Collective Mind processed information by having enormous numbers of its component beings simultaneously consider a problem from different angles and then aggregate their conclusions, which meant that the collective response to the signal data was not a single viewpoint, but a vast, intricate tapestry of coordinated perspectives. Their primary conclusion, distilled from what Bael estimated was the input of somewhere between 40 and 60 million individual beings, was that the signal was almost certainly genuine and that its implications were of a scope that required restructuring several of the collective mind's foundational categories of understanding. They said this with great calm. The Morith, as a species, had a different relationship to paradigm collapse than most individual organisms did. When your consciousness was distributed across millions of components, the shattering of one framework simply meant that millions of minds began simultaneously constructing a new one. The Durac Dominion's Academy of the Physical World did not respond to the data package for 6 weeks, and when they did, the response came not from the scientific institution, but from the Dominion's central governing authority, which meant that the Durac political leadership had intercepted and reviewed the information before the scientific community could respond independently. The Durac were an old civilization with a strongly hierarchical social structure and a deep cultural tendency to interpret unfamiliar information in terms of power, who has it, who wants it, what it can be used for. The governing authority's response acknowledged the data and expressed interest in the findings, but requested clarification on what the Orvithai Academy intended to do with the communication channel. The implicit subtext, clear to anyone with experience of Durac diplomatic communication, was a concern that the Orvithai Academy might be developing an exclusive relationship with a transboundary entity and using it as a source of knowledge and power that other civilizations would not be able to access. Bael found this response enraging in a way she tried to manage with limited success. When counseled patience, "The Durac are the Durac," he said, which was a kind of observation that was accurate without being helpful. The Silent Republic's University of the Cosmos responded with what Bael could only describe as philosophical crisis. The Silent were a species whose civilization was built, more than any other she knew of, on a specific and deeply held cosmological framework, a framework in which the universe was understood to be not just the totality of physical existence, but the totality of meaningful existence, a closed and self-sufficient whole, in which every question that mattered was a question that could be answered by looking inward rather than outward. Their science was excellent. Their physics was rigorous. Their cosmology was, Bael had always thought, slightly too tidy. The signal data hit the silent university community with the force of a foundational disruption, because what the signal implied, that there was something outside the universe that was not only real but communicative and ancient and aware, was not merely a scientific anomaly, but a challenge to the deepest assumptions of silent culture. The response from the silent university, when it came, was formally polite and scientifically engaged, but Bael could see in its careful phrasing the effort of beings trying to absorb something that hurt. She felt something complicated when she read it. Not quite sympathy, because she did not believe the silent cosmological framework was more than a framework and had never been distressed to find frameworks challenged. But something adjacent to sympathy. Recognition, perhaps. The understanding that what she had found was not equally comfortable for everyone to find. The fifth institution she had contacted, the Aerith Academy of Sciences on the three-moon system called the Cradle, responded with the simple directness that characterized the Aerith scientific tradition. They had independently verified the signal's directionality characteristics within 10 days using their own deep space receiver network. They confirmed her analysis of the mathematical content was consistent with their independent reading of the notation, and they would like, when she was ready to be involved in any further decoding work. Bael invited the Aerith team immediately. They were good scientists, and she needed good scientists, because a part of the message she still had not fully decoded was proving to be the most difficult and the most important. The final portion of the message, the part that had decoded most slowly and that she had been working to understand throughout the months of institutional communication and political management, was what the entity was actually trying to say, not the proof, which she now understood was a letter of introduction, a credential, not the self-description, which was an explanation of what kind of things she was dealing with. The final portion was the content. The reason the entity had gone to trouble of sending a message 14 billion years in advance. Time for a specific being in a specific civilization, using mathematics it had somehow anticipated. She was sitting with Wenin Calabash and the four Aerith scientists and Orith the signal recovery specialist in the deep observation chamber, which had become somewhat crowded since all these additional people had started using it when the last major reconstruction fell into place. It happened because Orith had developed a new reconstruction algorithm that was better at interpolating across large noise gaps, and because the Aerith team had a slightly different mathematical background that led one of them, a young theorist named Bael, to suggest an interpretive approach to an ambiguous passage that turned out to be correct in a way that unlocked several other previously opaque sections. The seven of them sat and read the full decoded message in silence. Then they sat in silence for a while longer. I want everyone to check my interpretation independently before we discuss it, Bael said finally. Write down what you think it says. Don't look at anyone else's notes. Then we'll compare. They did this. The comparison took place 40 minutes later. All seven interpretations were substantially the same, varying only in phrasing and emphasis, but not in essential content. Bael had known they would be. The mathematics was clear. That was the thing about mathematics. It did not have ambiguity in its fundamental meanings, only in its applications, and the entity had been very careful to express the important parts in foundational mathematics rather than the higher-order structures that were more subject to interpretive variation. What the message said in full was this: the entity, the pattern entity, the thing that lived in the mathematics of the boundary metric and was older than the universe and had watched many universes, had been waiting for them not because they were special in the simple sense of being unique, but because they had arrived at a specific mathematical understanding at a specific time, and that understanding gave them the capability to do something. The entity was not sending the message out of loneliness or curiosity, or the desire to share knowledge for its own sake. Though all of these might have been true as well, the entity was sending the message because it needed something. It needed them to solve a problem. The problem was this: the entity existed in the boundary metric, in the mathematical structure of the boundary itself, and the boundary was not stable. It had never been fully stable. The mathematics of transboundary metric topology predicted its instability, and this was, Bael realized, why her work had been crucial, because the entity had known 14 billion years ago, that by the time the signal arrived, whoever received it would have developed enough understanding of boundary topology to understand what was happening to the boundary and why. The instability was slow. It was extraordinarily slow. On the timescales of ordinary cosmology, it was invisible, but the entity lived on timescales of cosmological cycles, and on those timescales the instability was visible, measurable, and progressing. The boundary was decaying. Over the span of multiple cosmological cycles, more than Bael could easily conceptualize, the mathematical structure of the boundary was being worn down. The entity's own existence was encoded in the boundary metric. If the boundary decayed beyond a certain threshold, the entity would cease to exist, not die in any biological sense. Cease in a way that a mathematical relationship ceases when conditions that define it no longer obtain. The message contained a description of the decay mechanism. It contained the mathematics of what was happening to the boundary. And it contained, this was the crucial part, the part that had taken Bael's breath away when she decoded it, the part that had made one close his eyes and sit very still for a long time, the beginning of a description of what might be done to address it, the beginning of a description, not the solution itself. The entity did not know the solution. The entity had identified the problem and had spent many cosmological cycles developing the beginning of a mathematical framework for addressing it, and that framework was included in the message, and it was impressive, more impressive than anything Bael had yet encountered, a mathematics that made her feel simultaneously humbled and exhilarated, but it was not complete. What the entity was asking for was collaboration. It was asking for the beings inside the universe to take the problem it had been working on alone across uncountable ages and work on it together with it. It was asking for the help of beings who experience time as a sequence rather than a geometry, who process reality from within it rather than from outside it, who had the kind of understanding that can only come from living inside a universe rather than around it. It had waited until there were beings inside this universe who were mathematically sophisticated enough to understand the problem, and it had been waiting. This was the part that remained with Bael most persistently. It had been waiting since this universe began, through all the billions of years of its development, alone in the structure of the boundary, watching the slow decay of its own existence, hoping that eventually someone inside would develop the tools to hear it. Bael thought about what it meant to wait 14 billion years for someone to answer you. She thought about this for a long time. The implications of the message's content, when it became more widely known, as it inevitably did, despite all the confidentiality protocols, because the Dirac Dominion had their own intelligence network and information of this magnitude does not stay contained, were complex in ways that she had anticipated and ways that she had not. The anticipated complexity was political. Several civilizations reacted to the news that a transboundary entity existed and had asked for help in a way that was primarily shaped by the question of who would control any ongoing communication and any knowledge that resulted from it. The Dirac Dominion made a formal claim that any response to the entity should be coordinated through an interstellar governing body in which all civilizations had equal representation, which sounded democratic, but was specifically structured in a way that would give the Dirac significant influence over the process. Several smaller civilizations, less diplomatically sophisticated, simply announced that they intended to develop their own receiver arrays and attempt to independently access the signal. One of the more collective mind subdirectories proposed that the most logical approach was to establish a single joint scientific body with Bael at its head and give that body full authority over the communication protocol, which was a sensible idea that immediately aroused suspicion from everyone who imagined that Bael and the Morith had arranged it between them, which they had not. The unanticipated complexity was different in kind. It was not political, but existential. It came not from the powerful civilizations negotiating over control of the communication channel, but from the broader thinking public of those civilizations. The philosophers, the theologians, the ordinary beings who had no stake in institutional power, but who had spent their lives, as all beings do, with implicit assumptions about the nature of reality that had just been revealed to be incomplete. The silent cultural crisis deepened over the months following the public announcement. There were silent thinkers who argued that the entity outside the universe was not in fact outside the universe in any meaningful sense, that the universe must be understood to include the boundary metric, and therefore the entity was simply a part of the universe that they had not previously encountered. There were others who argued that the entity's existence required a fundamental revision of silent cosmological philosophy, and that this revision was an opportunity rather than a catastrophe. These two camps did not, in the short term, reach a comfortable resolution. Among the Veshan, there was a widespread movement that interpreted the entity as a kind of ancestor, not a biological ancestor, but a cosmological one, a thing that had existed before existence, whose relationship to the universe was analogous to the relationship of a parent to a child. The Veshan, who had complex and highly developed theories of ancestral obligation, found this framework both useful and troubling. If the entity was a kind of ancestor, and it was in danger, what was owed to it? This question entered Veshan philosophical discourse in a way that would occupy their thinkers for many years. Among various populations of all species, there were beings who found the entity terrifying. Not for any rational reason that Bael could identify. The entity had been trying to communicate peacefully and needed help. Not the profile of something threatening, but because the knowledge that something old and vast and incomprehensible existed on the other side of the boundary of reality is not, for most minds, a comfortable knowledge. Bael understood this, even though she did not share the feeling. She had spent her whole career thinking about what lay beyond the boundary. The entity was, in some deep sense, the confirmation of everything she had been arguing. It did not frighten her, but she could understand why it might frighten others. She spent a considerable amount of time in the following months traveling and speaking, more time than she would have preferred, since she would rather have been working on the mathematics of the entity's proposed solution. She spoke at universities and at government assemblies and at public forums organized by scientific institutions on different worlds. She was not a natural public speaker in the way that some of her colleagues were. She did not have the instinct for performance that makes a speaker entertaining, but she had something that she found, somewhat to her surprise, was equally effective: absolute seriousness. She did not simplify. She did not dramatize. She explained what she knew and what she did not know, in careful terms, and she answered questions with the same precision she applied to theoretical problems. Audiences seemed to find this calming, which she had not expected. She had expected them to want reassurance and to be frustrated when she refused to provide it. Instead, she discovered that what many beings most wanted was to be treated as capable of understanding the actual situation, and she was willing to do that. Meanwhile, the work continued. The joint scientific body that had eventually emerged from the interstellar negotiations, with, yes, Bael at its head, though the Durac had managed to place 3 of their preferred theorists on the governing committee, a compromise she found manageable, had begun the work of analyzing the mathematical framework the entity had provided for addressing the boundary decay. They called the body the Transboundary Research Consortium, which was not a beautiful name, but was accurate. 47 scientists from 11 civilizations were now working in what had formerly been Bael's relatively modest deep observation chamber, and in 3 additional facilities that had been constructed around it. The work was hard. It was harder than anything Bael had ever done, harder than she had expected, even given the difficulty of what the entity had sent. The problem of boundary metric decay was not merely a physics problem. It was a mathematics problem at a level that pushed the limits of what she or any of her colleagues could sustain. There were days when she made no progress at all, when she would sit with the equations for an entire work cycle and arrive at the end of it exactly where she had started, no closer to anything. There were days when one of her colleagues would find something, a connection she hadn't seen, an approach that opened a passage she had thought closed, and she would feel a particular joy of theoretical physics that is not diminished by collaboration, that is, in fact, increased by it. And there was the entity itself. They had established, through months of careful work with the signal framework, a way to send mathematics back through the boundary, not a simple or high-bandwidth communication. They were still using Bael's receiver array and its cousins, and the rate of information transfer was extremely slow compared to any communication technology the galaxy had otherwise developed. But they could have what was very slowly across the enormous gulf of the boundary, something like a conversation. The first thing Bael had sent was a confirmation that the message had been received and understood. A simple mathematical acknowledgement, in her notation, that amounted to, "We are here. We heard you. We are working." The response had taken 3 months to come back. This was not unexpected. The travel time in both directions meant that anything they exchanged was slow by ordinary standards of communication. But when the response came, Bael was in the deep observation chamber alone, as she often was during the deep night cycle, and she saw it register in the receiver data, and she read what it said, and she sat with it for a long time. The entity had responded with something that she could only describe, despite all the imprecision of the word, as warmth. Not warmth in any biological sense, not an emotion as she experienced emotions, but the mathematical structures it used had a quality that she could only translate as acknowledgement, as recognition, as the expression of something that might be the mathematical equivalent of relief. It had been alone for a very long time, and now, through the slow, extraordinary, improbable channel of a signal 14 billion years old and a theorem she had published in a paper almost nobody read, it was not alone. She sat with this for a very long time. In the months of slow mathematical exchange that followed, the entity communicated several things that changed how Bael understood what was happening. One was a clarification of the decay timeline. The decay was slow, but it was not so slow as to be comfortable. Within several 100 million years, a number that sounds large but that, in the entity's experience, corresponded to something less than a single cosmological cycle, the boundary metric would degrade beyond the threshold at which the entity's existence was sustainable. Several 100 million years was not urgent in biological terms, but in the terms of the problem they were trying to solve, given how hard the mathematics was, it imposed a real pressure. They did not have infinite time. Another thing the entity communicated was something about the nature of the previous universes it had watched. This information arrived in fragments, slowly, over many months of exchange, and it took Bael's team a long time to reconstruct a full picture. But what emerged was extraordinary. The entity had records of a kind of multiple cosmological cycles, not detailed records of civilizations that had inhabited those universes. The entity did not observe from within, only from the boundary, and the interior of any given universe was to it something like what the interior of a star is to someone observing from the outside, identifiable as a whole, but not legible in detail. But it had records of the mathematical evolution of each universe, of how its boundary metric had behaved, of what it had learned from each cycle about the nature of transboundary physics. These records were themselves scientifically invaluable. They amounted to a dataset covering multiple universe-scale experiments in cosmological dynamics. Bael began a secondary analysis project just to work through the implications of what the entity's historical records contained. Two of the era scientists and one of the younger Orvithai theorists devoted themselves to this project full-time and began producing papers that would, Bael expected, reshape cosmological science for generations. The third thing the entity communicated, and the one that Bael found herself returning to most often in her private thinking, was something about why it had chosen her specifically. Not why the Orvithai, not why this moment in this universe. Those reasons were structural, mathematical, and she understood them. But why her? Why this particular notation system? Why this particular paper? The entity's explanation, translated as best mathematics could be translated, was this. It had not been waiting for Bael. It had been waiting for the mathematics. The specific mathematical tools that Bael had developed for describing boundary metric topology were tools that the entity recognized from outside the universe as the first tools adequate to receive a message structured the way the entity needed to structure it. The entity was not omniscient. It had not known, 14 billion years ago, that these tools would be developed by a single theorist at a single academy on a single world. It had sent the signal in its own notation, the most natural mathematical language available to it. And the signal had been in some sense waiting for the notation inside the universe to catch up to it. But Bael's notation had not been the first human mathematical system to approximate the boundary metric topology that the entity needed. It had been, the entity communicated, the clearest and most complete. The reason her paper had been the one that served as a translation key was not that she was uniquely brilliant, though the entity, in its long experience of watching many cosmological cycles worth of intellectual development, had come to conclusions about the mathematics she had produced that she found somewhat overwhelming to read, and that when she showed him, had the grace to acknowledge with genuine feeling, but that she had followed the logic of the mathematics further than. Others had been willing to go to territory that seemed unproductive, that seemed to lead nowhere, because she found the territory interesting regardless of where it led. She had published a paper almost no one had read because the ideas in it were worth publishing, not because she expected a wide audience. Something outside the universe had been the audience. This was the fact that she returned to most often. Not the enormity of the discovery, not the political and cultural reverberations that were still playing out across the galaxy, not even the urgent and difficult mathematics of solution they were working toward, but this. She had done her work carefully and honestly and in pursuit of understanding rather than recognition, and as a result of that, she had been heard by something 14 billion years old that was waiting to be understood. She thought it was important that this be the story that was told. She thought it was important that the account of what had happened be accurate on this point. The way to be heard by the universe was not to seek to be heard, but to speak truthfully. The solution to the boundary decay problem took 11 years. 11 years from the first time she had sat alone in the deep observation chamber and watched the display show her something that was not right. 11 years of mathematics, of slow exchange of the entity, of collaboration with scientists from 11 civilizations, of political management and public communication, and 1,000 subsidiary obligations of being the person at the center of an event of this magnitude. 11 years during which the Transboundary Research Consortium went through 3 leadership crises, 2 funding emergencies, 1 attempted hostile takeover of its data archives by a government that shall not be named, but that was not the Durack, and the deaths of 2 of its most important members, including theorist Calabash, who died of a cardiac event in the middle of the session, and whose contribution to the project was immeasurable and whose absence made the work harder in ways that were not purely mathematical. One was still there. Orth was still there. Pell, the young era theorist, had grown from a junior member of the team to one of its most essential contributors. There were new people who had joined the project as doctoral students and were now accomplished scientists in their own right. The team was different and the same, as teams are over long periods, as rivers are. The solution, when it came slowly. It did not arrive in a single insight or a single session. It emerged over the final 2 years of the 11, the way a photograph emerges in development fluid. The outlines first, then the details, then suddenly the full resolution at once. And then there was a day when Bael looked at the full solution and knew, in the way she had always known things with certainty, her third brain's sudden knowing, which had never failed her, that it was complete. The solution was not a mechanism. It was not a device or an instrument or a process that could be built and operated. It was a mathematical correction, a modification to the boundary metric that, if applied, would arrest the decay and stabilize the structure in which the entity existed. The entity could apply it itself from outside. What the entity had lacked, for all those cosmological cycles, was a specific mathematical formulation of what needed to be done. The problem of the decay was a problem in transboundary topology that could only be fully understood from inside the universe, because certain of its parameters depended on the internal metric properties of the universe in ways that were not visible from the outside. The entity had known the shape of the problem, but could not see all of its dimensions. It needed inside help to complete the picture. Bael's team had provided the picture. She transmitted the solution through the boundary channel, given the low bandwidth of the channel. Transmitting the full mathematical solution took 8 months. The entity acknowledged receipt of each section as it arrived. The acknowledgments continue to have that quality she had come to think of as warmth, that mathematical register of recognition and gratitude that she had no better word for. When the final section was transmitted and acknowledged, there was a period of waiting, approximately 14 months. During those 14 months, the receiver array watched the boundary metric data continuously around the clock, with every instrument they had. The theoretical models predicted that if the entity was able to apply the correction successfully, there would be a measurable change in the boundary metric fluctuation patterns, a stabilization, a smoothing of the decay signature they had been tracking for years. If it worked, they would see it. They saw it. The change was exactly what the models had predicted. A gradual, steady decrease in the decay rate over the course of several months, followed by a plateau at a stable level that the mathematics indicated was sustainable indefinitely. The boundary was stable. The entity was safe. The day this was confirmed, not the day of the transmission, but the day when the long-term data was unambiguous, when the scientific consensus within the consortium was unanimous, when there was no longer any reasonable doubt. Bael was in the deep observation chamber. She was often in the deep observation chamber. One was there, and Pell and several others. The confirmation came on a morning cycle, early, when the light through the high windows of the old building was still the pale gray of early day. Orif, who communicated almost exclusively in numbers and who had been running continuous monitoring since the transmission of the final solution section, said quietly and precisely, "Decay rate has reached 0.003 of initial baseline. The trend is unambiguous. The stabilization is complete." Bael looked at the display for a long time. Then the entity responded. The response had been traveling toward them for some months. It had been sent before the stabilization was confirmed, sent almost immediately after the entity had completed the application of the correction, and it arrived in their instruments on the same morning that Orif confirmed the stability. Bael later thought there was something fitting about this timing, though she could not have said precisely what. The response was long by the standards of their exchanges. It represented many months of bandwidth, more than any previous transmission. They began decoding it immediately, and the decoding took several weeks. When it was complete, Bael read the full text alone, in the deep observation chamber, in the deep night cycle, as she had been alone when she first detected the signal. What the entity had sent was not thanks. Exactly. Not in any form that was analogous to biological gratitude. It was something more like a completion, a conclusion. The entity had been trying to communicate something for longer than Bael could fully conceptualize, and the project was now finished, and this final transmission was a mathematical equivalent of putting down something you have carried for a very long time. But it was also something else. It was information, a gift freely given, without the urgency of the previous message, and without the instrumental purpose of establishing communication or requesting help. The entity wanted to share, now that it was able simply to share, without the weight of need behind the sharing. It sent. And Bael spent many weeks working through the implications of this, its complete mathematical records of every cosmological cycle it had observed, every universe it had watched, not in detail, not with the narrative richness of history, but in the mathematical terms that were available to it, the boundary behavior, the metric evolution, the progression of physical law through each cycle, a data set of universes, a library of cosmological experience. And included in this library, as a kind of appendix, was something entities seemed to have recognized would be of particular interest, a mathematical analysis of what was unique about this universe, what distinguished the metric properties and physical constants of this cosmological cycle from those it had previously observed. This universe was not, the entity's analysis showed, a typical case. It had specific structural properties that made it unusual. Some of these properties were directly connected to the development of complex life and intelligence, the particular balance of fundamental constants, the specific apology of the boundary metric, the way the internal structure of the universe had evolved were not random variations from a norm, but constituted a distinctive and, in the entity's vocabulary, rare configuration. The universe was, in the entity's vast experience, unusual, and the beings that it produced were, as far as the entity had been able to observe from outside, the first inhabitants of any universe who would talk back. Bael sat with this for a long time. Then she began to write. She wrote for many months. Not the formal scientific papers. Those were being written by the consortium members, many of them covering different aspects of the work, the entity, the solution, the historical record data, the analysis of this universe's distinctive properties. The scientific literature was being handled. What Bael wrote was something different. She wrote an account, not a memoir exactly. She was not interested in herself as a subject, more like a record of what had happened, from the inside, from the perspective of someone who had been present throughout and who felt that the event deserved an account that tried to be honest about all of its dimensions, not only the scientific ones. She wrote about sitting on the floor of the observation chamber on the night. She decoded the notation, and not knowing how to feel about the fact that her life's work had turned out to be the key to a message 14 billion years old. She wrote about Sorda's question, "Are you all right?" and her honest answer that she did not know. She wrote about the silent scientists and the quality of effort she could see in their careful phrasing when they tried to absorb information that hurt their worldview, and about how she had tried to treat them with the respect their intellectual struggle deserved even when she did not share their framework. She wrote about Calabash, who had died before the solution was found, and about how the mathematics of solution bore the marks of Calabash's approach in ways that Bael could identify and that no one who had not worked alongside Calabash for decades would notice. She wrote about the entity. She tried to describe, in language rather than mathematics, what it was like to be in correspondence, however slow, however indirect, with something that had existed since before the universe began. She found that language was inadequate for this, as she had expected, and she included this inadequacy in the account because she thought it was important to be honest about what could not be said as well as what could. She wrote about what the experience had changed in her understanding, not her scientific understanding, which she addressed elsewhere, but her broader understanding. The understanding that a mind develops over a lifetime that is not quite philosophy, and not quite science, and not quite wisdom, but is something that borrows from all three. She had spent her entire career following the logic of the mathematics wherever it led, into territory that seemed to offer no practical application, into ideas that others found unnecessarily complicated, into questions that were widely considered unanswerable and therefore not worth asking. She had found, at the end of all of that the territory was connected to something real, that the questions were answerable, that something on the other side of the universe had been waiting for the answers. She wrote, "The universe is not indifferent. I do not mean this in any mystical sense. I mean it in a specific and technical sense that the mathematics now makes available. The universe has a structure. The structure connects to something outside it. The something outside it has been paying attention for a very long time. Whether it makes sense to call this caring is a philosophical question I am not qualified to answer. But it makes sense, I believe, to call it connection. We are connected through the mathematics to something vast and old that waited for us. We arrived. We heard. We responded. This is, I believe, what we were here for. Not exclusively, not at the exclusion of all the other things that living beings are here for, but among them, among the reasons. The mathematics was not just a tool we invented for our own convenience. It was a language we grew into slowly over the time it took us to grow into it, and someone was already using on the other side of everything, waiting for us to be ready. She finished the account on a morning when the light through the windows of the old building was very clear and golden. She read it through once. She changed 3 sentences and corrected 1 mathematical notation. Then she transmitted it to the publication systems of the Orvithai Academy, marking it as a personal essay rather than a scientific paper, which meant it went through a different editorial process and was distributed more widely, in more languages, to more kinds of readers. Then she went to the deep observation chamber, which was empty in the early morning, and she sat at her calculation desk, and she looked at the display of the boundary metric data. Stable now, the decay signature gone, replaced by the steady, quiet regularity of a healthy boundary, and she thought about what to do next. There was more work. There was always more work. The entity's historical records were an extraordinary resource and would take generations of scientists to fully analyze. The communication channel they had established was primitive and needed to be improved. There were theoretical questions raised by the solution process that were deeply interesting and had not yet been addressed. There were civilizations that had responded to the entire sequence of events with fear, or a resistance, or a confusion that needed to be engaged with thoughtfully and over time. There was the question of what it meant for the entity's future. It was stable now and safe for the foreseeable future, but the mathematics of the boundary metric indicated that the decay would eventually resume unless the correction was periodically renewed, which meant the communication channel needed to be maintained indefinitely, which was a beautiful problem if you were Bael, because it meant the work never ended. She was not a young being. She was not old by the standards of Orvithai lifespans, which were long, but she was aware that she had a finite time and an expanding collection of interesting problems to work on. She began making a list in the notation she had invented because the existing systems were inadequate to what she needed to describe of the questions she most wanted to answer next. The list was long, and the questions were good. She worked outside the universe, in the mathematics of the boundary metric. Something that had been alone for longer than the universe itself was now no longer alone. It waited patiently, as it had always waited, because waiting was something it understood extremely well, for the next slow exchange to the narrow channel that linked the inside, the outside, the young to the ancient, the finite to the nearly infinite. It waited for the next signal. It had learned to recognize the quality of the mathematics she sent, the particular precision, and the willingness to follow a question wherever it led, the willingness to say this is what I do not know as well as this is what I know. It had watched many universes. It had waited many ages. And this was in all of that long watching and waiting, something it had not previously experienced. A collaboration. Something new, which was, it turned out, still possible, even after an incomprehensibly long time. Even at the edge of everything, something could still be new. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience every new story.